Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horn, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horn, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast. I am delighted today to have in our virtual studio Jim Harter, Dr. Jim Harter. He has spent a lifetime focused on a mission of conducting research on the relationship between human potential and organizational outcomes. But let me elaborate on that mission or purpose just a bit. Jim Harter is the chief scientist for Gallup's workplace management and well-being practices. He is the co-author of the #1 Wall Street Journal and Washington Post bestseller, It's the Manager. Who doesn't love that title? That was released in 2019. Dr. Harter's work has appeared in the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and Time Magazine, in addition to many other publications. I also want to tell you that Jim is the primary researcher and author of the first large-scale multi-organization study to investigate the relationship between work unit employee engagement in business results that include profitability, productivity, turnover, customer engagement, safety, and health, and updated periodically. And this study currently covers more than 82,000 business units and includes 1.8 million employees in 230 organizations across 49 industries and in 73 countries. Someone there has a fascination with numbers in Jim's bio. And, let me just say a little more that Jim's the co-author of the New York Times bestseller 12, The Great Elements of Great Managing. And I wonder if that has to do with the Gallup Q12 and how we might think about that. And the New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, Wellbeing, The 5 Essential Elements. And Jim's co-authored or authored more than 1,000 research studies on topics in applied psychology and well-being. His specialties include psychological measurement and estimating the economic impact of management activities. And given Jim's association with Gallup, I think it's important that everyone know his top 5 Clifton strengths. And they are achiever, focus, learner, relator, and futuristic. Jim, I am so delighted to have you in our studio. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be with you today. Looking forward to it.
And can you say a few words about yourself? I mean, that's quite an impressive record of achievement you've accomplished. But a few words about yourself and how you might summarize or have our audience of people and culture leaders think about it.
Well, I get a chance to work with our team at Gallup. We've got a really good research team. We really enjoy working together and have fun at work and like to dig deep into a lot of these topics that are relevant to organizations. I think the most important thing to me in my career is that I'm doing research that can be applied. And so I try to filter it that way. We go into a lot of the complexity behind the numbers, but then try to pull out. This is part of the fun challenge of my work, is to try to pull out some of those nuggets that are practical and that can be applied and that are reliable and useful. And some of them just kind of transcend time. Some of them are very topical, as we found out the last couple of years. The data have gotten old much faster than in the times of the past, but with all the changes that we're experiencing now. And so it's been a very interesting time to study workplaces, and it will be, I think, for the foreseeable future.
The workplace in so many places around the world is in a state of shift as the economies around the world shift and resources also shift around the world. Jim, I wonder if you could put some context around, all of us have heard a couple of expressions. We've heard about quiet quitting. We've heard about great resignation. Maybe people place some more weight in the Great Resignation, a particular event at a particular time. But can you put any of this in context for us? I mean, is there a difference between quiet quitting and Great Resignation? I know one may have more of a TikTok following.
Well, I think they're somewhat related, and they've both gotten a lot of attention over the last year plus. The quiet quitting one more recently. Quite frankly, quiet quitting is not new. We've been measuring 3 categories of employees in terms of their attitudes toward work: those who are engaged, those who are not engaged, and those who are actively disengaged. That middle kind of not engaged group are very much aligned with what a lot of people are describing as quiet quitting, although the TikTok posts and comments and everything are probably a little bit closer to loud quitting, and that's that actively disengaged group where people are kind of emotionally against what their organization's about, and most of their workplace needs are unmet, and they're a bit more on the angry side. The not engaged are the ones that are showing up. They'll do the minimum required, but not much else. And I think it's related to the Great Resignation, the so-called Great Resignation, because there's more of a boldness, so that even though about half of people have been in that quiet quitting category historically, and we've been trained in engagement back to 2000, and it's been around that percentage since then. But they're more vocal now because I think the workplace has a new freedom, and I think that had something to do with COVID. And I think that the Great Resignation also had something to do with COVID, in that people had a chance to reflect and sit back and think about what they really want out of their work, and to consider all the other options that are available. A professor at Texas A&M, Anthony Klotz, hypothesized that he's the one that actually predicted the Great Resignation, not an economist, but him, a psychologist. And he hypothesized, and I agree, that there's some pent-up frustration, because the percentage of people who are looking for a job, either actively looking or watching for openings, even before the pandemic, was about the same, a little bit higher. It peaked up a little bit higher during COVID, but not dramatically higher. What happened, though, was the relationship between engagement and whether people were actively looking for a job or watching for openings increased. So I think what happened is exactly what he described, is that there's some pent-up, people had a chance to reflect, in that pent-up frustration. They acted on it because they had some choices. They learned they had some choices out there in the workplace. And I relate both that and this phenomenon called quiet quitting back to, if I was going to point to one thing, it'd be the manager. It'd be how people are managed. And I think organizations now have to kind of pivot in terms of how they think about management. We've always known it's important, but how we approach managing, in many cases now from a distance, hybrid environments, people coming and going, is really critical. We're seeing effects on engagement have been particular. There have been drops in engagement, increases in active disengagement, about 6 percentage point drop, which is really big pre-pandemic till now among young workers in particular. And so,
and how do we think about young workers, Jim? How do we define those or describe those folks?
Yeah, we've been thinking about it from the perspective of Gen Z and young millennials, people under the age of 35. That particular group has moved more from engaged to actively disengaged, and so they're vocalizing it. They're looking for other opportunities, and they're much more willing to be looking for other jobs. And
do we find the same phenomena, Jim? It's interesting as people rise in the ranks of organizations, and often there's an age-related relationship between rank in organization and age. What's going on with levels of engagement at more senior levels of an organization?
Particularly among managers, we saw a decrease in engagement and an increase in burnout during COVID, because managers have a lot coming at them. Not quite so much at the senior leader level, although engagement changed a little bit for that group, but primarily among managers. So if you think about, a lot of the pressure is being, and I said a lot of this relates back to local management, but there's also we have to be really clear. There's also a lot of different things they're taking on. They've got things coming at them from a lot of different directions, both the communication of what the organization is trying to get done. You could list off, 15 different job responsibilities of a manager, but I would say that the most important one now and going forward is to be thinking about manager as coach. And one outcome that we've been finding is really impactful is whether managers have at least one meaningful conversation with each person they manage every week. So that'd be one outcome to be thinking about in this hybrid type environment. But senior leadership didn't really increase much in burnout, but local level managers did. And I think that's something that organizations need to do something about. So how managers themselves are managed is a really important component of how things need to work better going forward.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have it right, but I've always had a frame of reference that that your research, the Gallup's research in the workplace, has been that about 70% of employee engagement is within managerial control. Is that still about right, Jim?
Yeah, about 70% of the variance in team level engagement goes back to areas that are directly related to the manager, whether that's their own engagement, the natural kind of predispositions they bring with them. We call it manager talent, and what they actually do with their team. The behaviors that they engage in with their team on a daily basis. Those all add up to that amount. And that's a conservative estimate too. It's not like it's actually probably a little bit higher than that, but the conservative estimate is 70% of the variance in team engagement. So they have a big impact, and it's actually at all levels. So if you're a senior leader, the people you directly manage are in that as well. So that that cascade from senior leadership on through the organization is really important. And we've seen some deterioration in terms of clarity, particularly among the younger folks, clarity of expectations, whether people feel connected to the mission or purpose of the organization. So I'm seeing in the data now, since pre-COVID, a little bit of a deterioration in terms of the relationship between the employer and an employee, or I should put it the other way, employee, and their perception of the employer and whether they feel highly connected and loyal. Even how they feel about customers. They're much less likely to say that they feel great responsibility for the quality of service customers receive, or that their organization is delivering on the promise they make to customers. That's troubling because a lot of what we ought to filter, management through is and how people work, where they work should be related to both how customers are being served effectively and how teams can collaborate, and you can build a culture that attracts star employees. Keep going.
And if I recall from some other reports, I wonder to what extent does this relate to trust in organizations and trust in leadership? I think there's been a gradual decline, at least on the American scene, in trust in political leaders, trust in anyone in the robed professions, and yet organizational leaders or organizations themselves were still retaining some levels of trust among employees. Do you think that that's at play as well?
Definitely. That's a really important point. So about one in five people, 20% of people, employees in the workplace in the U.S. strongly agree that they trust the leadership of their organization. And that's the highest correlate with another really important item that we ask right now, whether employees feel that their organization cares about their overall well-being. That's related to burnout. And it's a really important perception because if people do feel that you care about their well-being, they're much more likely to stay. That's a criteria for people in picking jobs right now, whether they feel it like their workplace will improve their well-being. It's somewhat related to this topic we talked about earlier on quiet quitting. People want to draw some boundaries, and it's the manager's job really to figure out those boundaries and to ask people the right kinds of questions. To give you an example, Mike, we asked employees in the U.S. Whether they prefer a 9-to-5 job, a 9-to-5 type job, where work and life are separated, or whether they would prefer a job where work and life are blended, throughout the day. Guess what the answer was? 50-50.
Interesting.
Exactly half wanted work and life separated. The other half wanted the blend. And you could argue maybe that changes a little bit through the course of our lives, depending on what's going on, how many, our kids, whatever might be going on in our lives. And for some people, it's always kind of that one way or the other.
Sure.
I've always been a blender because we've always had, flex time at Gallup all the way back to 1969. I haven't been there that long, but as long as I've been there, and it started in 69. So we've always had flex time. That allowed me to get my doctorate done while I was working full time. It worked for me. But there's other people that like to separate that out. And if you're a manager and you don't know that about somebody, you could build a lot of distrust, a lot of disrespect, because you're just kind of making assumptions about how people will work and when they'll work and that sort of thing, or imposing that on them. So I'm going on a little bit of a tangent there, but that trust in leadership is really important. But the interesting thing to me is it does flow through the manager, even though, we can look at an organization's overall level of trust and leadership. When you look at it by manager-led teams, it varies widely. So the very same leadership, people perceive differently depending on the manager team that they're on. So part of it is how the manager filters information from leadership and explains it to people. It's easy as a manager to kind of say us versus them, right?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Many of our listeners are interested in the topic of authentic leadership. And at the foundation of authentic leadership is the element of trust. And there are issues and criticisms related to the scalability of that and how it flows through an organization. Does that also help us to understand that it's less about human resources today and more about people if you're a manager, and how we begin? What does your data, what does your research or your experience suggest about how managers successfully build trust? I get the relationship with well-being, and whether it's causal or an outcome or some combination of both. What are those antecedents to trust, or the conditions that create that?
It's an incredibly important concept, because if you really do want to impact somebody's well-being, you got to start by building trust, so that they don't think it's just kind of a show, or that you're doing things just to pacify them, so to speak. And to do that, you've got to start with the work-related elements. They need a job that's where they have a clear role. People want to come to work and have a purpose, and they want to come to work and have a role that they're responsible for, and clear expectations. They need to have the materials, equipment they need to do their work. They need to have a chance to do what they do best every day. These are basic expectations. If they do something well, you better recognize them for it. They want credit for it. And they should also be, someone who gives recognition to others as well. But so it starts with some of the foundational elements of engagement, really. That's where trust begins to be built. If you fail on those, you're going to have a really tough time building any kind of trust at all, because you're not giving people the basic expectations they expect. That what our human nature expects when we come to work is to have a role, to have an important role, to have a purpose we can connect our work to have people around us that care about us, and we can see where our future might be in the organization and chances to develop. So I would say it starts right there with those basics. And during COVID, it was really about managers keeping people informed. People need to know what's going on. Otherwise, they people can easily create stories on their own and talk to their coworkers about it, and you get all the gossip around that about, it may not be accurate gossip, but managers just basically keeping people informed about what's going on, even if they don't know for sure. Being clear about uncertainty.
I always described it as a state of hallucination that, people want to close the gap. I mean, they want to eliminate the tension, and they will complete the story for you. So interesting about how that happens. And it sort of reminds me, of way back in time with Doug McGregor and all the values around humanism and how those affect workplace experience and employee experience. Hey, Jim, let's just get into a couple of the key findings from the 22 State of the Global Workplace Report, which we've been discussing, essentially in some ways. But I'm particularly curious about employee engagement and life evaluation, and people who describe themselves as thriving. And what have we learned since 2009, or what have we learned in the last 15 years?
Well, the employee engagement we saw climbing for a decade, which was really encouraging. And since 2020 hit, we've seen it drop somewhat. Globally, it's dropped from a high of 22 down to, it's now 21 globally. So it went down to 20, now 21. And in the US, it's dropped even more. It was at a high of 36%, which none of these numbers are high enough, but to see a rise in an overall population is encouraging. But since then, we've seen some drops. We've seen, in terms of life evaluation, how people feel about their present and their future. It really varies a lot by geography. I mean, if you go to, Southern Asia, and India and some places like that, they really were hard hit, really more in 21 with COVID. And it's life evaluation gets hit harder by people in areas where there are less degrees of freedom, where people already are somewhat vulnerable. So that's where you see those compounding effects. Generally, what well-being overall is impacted by compounding effects. Of course, our work is one of those. That's also the rest of the elements of our well-being, our social lives, our financial well-being, if that's vulnerable, our physical well-being, of course, was a big one during COVID, and how our relationship with our communities is important as well. So those compounding effects impact the percentage of people who are thriving in the U.S., which was surprising to me. Just this past year, we reported a rise in suffering, and so there's I'm sure inflation had something to do with that. When you combine inflation with people who are already poor, there's again an extra vulnerability there, and you add on top of it something else, and that can have a big effect on well-being.
As one of my mentors said, the aim of all coaching is to reduce suffering. I don't necessarily agree. I think it's about increasing happiness and moving towards that. But it's fascinating around this, the relationship between what was going on with COVID and the relationship between engagement and life evaluation.
Well, COVID created a lot of new issues that, with all the remote working and everything, created some complexities. And then with the different spikes, there's kind of a start and stop that kind of kept happening. And early on, encouragingly, very early on during COVID, organizations did a really good job of responding. To give you some perspective, nearly half of people strongly agreed that their organization cares about their well-being. That's now at 21%. So people have kind of taken their eye off the ball a little bit there. And leaders, I think, are struggling with what they do I think they're seeing some of this quiet quitting out there, and what's happening with the workforce. They're probably seeing it pretty tangibly, and some of them are trying to decide, do we force people back into the office, or how do we handle that? And I think there are some answers that to that for leaders. In our data, anytime we ask someone about being required to do something, the engagement, burnout's higher, engagement's lower, well-being's lower, intent to stay or intent to leave is higher. So there was this new COVID kind of produced on one side some new learnings about how much work we can do independently, and it produced sort of an endowment effect, so that people got some freedom from it to work from home when they needed to, and found out they could do some of that. They could avoid a commute. And that's a learning from the individual side. But I think from a leadership standpoint, Mike, I think it's really important that leaders provide managers with the right tools and resources to have the conversations with people to make that this new autonomy that people have now kind of like a rational autonomy, so that it's not just about me, it's also about my coworkers, and it's also about our customers.
Yeah, and having been a Gallup customer in the past in different organizations, the materials and the support resources that Gallup provides to help people and culture executives and managers around an organization to grow engagement, it's quite remarkable. It's really an amazing repertoire, an amazing portfolio of resources that are available to really drive towards that. And I think if we want to encourage environments where people bring more of who they are to what they do, then, engagement's key to that. And yet, Jim, it's striking from the 22 global report that stress was reported at an all-time high, and certainly maybe some of that was COVID or is COVID related, but 44% of employees experienced stress a lot the previous day. More comments on that, Jim?
That did peak up during COVID, but it's not a trend that started. As you said, Mike, if you go back into that trend line, it started like a decade before then. So there's something systemic. We can't pin it all on COVID. So there's something systemic in workplaces and kind of that work-life connection that isn't quite working right. And that's where managers come in again, because managers are in the only position in the organization to be able to understand each person's situation and to know what that work-life blend looks like for each person and to accommodate for that if they can. So, you can have all the great programs, and you asked about HR earlier. I think HR is really important in terms of providing resources, but managers need to be familiar with those resources and be able to point people in the right direction based on their unique strengths. I don't think the answer to well-being and engagement is the same for any one individual. It's through who they naturally are. We don't have to reinvent ourselves to have high well-being or high employee engagement. We need to know who we are and leverage who we are to get into a position where we can have jobs that are in flow and have life that's in flow, as opposed to burnout. And those two things, flow and burnout, are closer than you might think. They're both high challenge states. In a flow state, you've got a situation where your manager helps you remove some barriers, and you can use your strengths on a regular basis to achieve something challenging. In a burnout state, you've got barriers. Your manager might be getting in the way. You might not have the resources you need. You might have much more than you could possibly get done on your plate. So those barriers cause the burnout in a high challenge state. So that's why all this is so important. And stress is an important thing for people, of course, to manage. And I think there's some ways managers can have a big impact on that. Organizations can as well. But managers are kind of the quarterback that's going to help steer them in the right direction and get them to the right resources.
That's right, Jim. And I want to relate some of this to, again, back on the U.S. scene and thinking about events that around social justice and social change and George Floyd. And how does all of that affect stress as well? I think about it. Diversity, equity, justice, inclusion professionals. George Floyd, if they were receiving 3 calls a month for their business, when that happened, they were getting 35 calls a month for their business. And stress-producing events and organizations for everyone. And how does the polling take all that into account as well?
Well, we tracked during early COVID, which included the George Floyd incident. We had been asking the U.S., not just employees, but the full U.S. population surveys every single day. So we were tracking that every day. And generally, big events don't disrupt employee engagement that much. But this one did. We saw a big change. And it affected, leaders' ability to lead and managers' ability to manage. It was about a 2 to 3 week period, and then it kind of bounced back. But it caused a big disruption for a short period of time because people had to figure out how to respond to it effectively. The one area that I'd really encourage organizations to ask their employees about, if you're surveying your employees on a regular basis, ask them whether they feel they're treated with respect. It's really a question more about disrespect, because people go into any work environment, any situation, just assuming that they're going to be treated with respect. It's kind of a default assumption that we have, I think, as human beings. And when we're not, it really stings. And it almost never goes away. I mean, it's really hard to fix that. We carry it with us. People, of course, apologies help and all that. But managers are in a position where they can kind of get ahead of those issues before they escalate. If they're not more like coaches and not thinking with people in the moment about what they're experiencing. And again, I'd say one meaningful conversation every week with each person you manage That includes knowing something about their goals, knowing something about their work-life blend, something about their strengths, recognizing them when you see good work. All those things can help managers get ahead of issues like that and know what's going on, even if you're in a more hybrid kind of situation where you don't see everybody face to face on a regular basis. So yeah, Mike, it was an event like that was very disruptive to workplaces. And of course, that's a really important topic that organizations are focused on now going forward. But that one simple inclusiveness item at work, I'm treated with respect, is really insightful and kind of gets to the essence of what we should be trying to do. I mean, there's more to it than that, like whether people feel they belong, but that's a basic.
So it seems to, I mean, one of the findings in the 22 report was that employee well-being is really the new workplace imperative. And I imagine that all of what you've been providing and discussing, I mean, leads to that finding in some ways.
It's even pre-pandemic, we saw a trend in the data where younger employees were saying the well-being of the organization, or my well-being, is a requirement or a criteria for picking the organization that I'm going to work with. There's people were well aware that work and life are more blended than ever because of technology, and of course during the pandemic when that hit, it just kind of it sped up. A lot of trends are already happening. There was a trend toward more remote working, but it just boom. It went from
accelerated.
5 or 6% to a peak of like 60%. And we learned there were more remote ready jobs than before, but it had a big effect on that.
And Jim, I mean, thanks for providing so much great guidance and wisdom and analysis of the state of the global workplace. And I'm wondering if we could just step back from that in some ways and to think about how do people and culture analytics how do people and culture executives, HR leaders, HR executive vice presidents, senior vice presidents, how do they begin to effectively think about using data about people and engagement in conducting their businesses? You reminded me as you were speaking about something I think I've learned in people and culture and human resources is that employees don't remember who their HR person is, but they sure remember who their manager is. Mm-hmm. And, I think for me, that always set the way of thinking about, human resources, not about some announcement from HR, but it's, how do you have managers and employees take accountability for the experience along with the support of the organization. But given so much information, disinformation, however you want to think about it, what are some of the important areas that you think people executives should be concentrating on today relative to measuring numbers, stacking up the employee experience? And why is it important? I mean, I think you've proven that time and time again, but an update might be good too.
Well, yeah, our approach has been to focus first on empirically what predicts performance in organizations, what keeps people in organizations, what leads to high customer value in organizations, and ultimately to profitability in organizations, and to really try to understand, are there some elements that transcend organizations, that are based in human nature that every organization will need to learn. Because when you learn some of those elements of human nature that generalize across organizations, you can build huge databases and gain really good insights about how to create change over time. If you keep changing things up that you don't need to change, like we just keep reinventing the wheel in terms of measurement, then we never really accumulate a ton of new knowledge in terms of how change can be related. So we focus a lot on empirical findings and then combine that with practical insights so that organizations can actually use it to make a difference. And in the survey world, that means boiling it down to the simplest, most parsimonious insights so managers and leaders can act on it quickly and create some change. The other thing, Mike, that I think is really important to understand when you're thinking about measurement is to separate out what is changeable in people to what is less likely changeable. We all have some innate tendencies about us. So we call them strengths. We've got a tool called Clifton Strengths that 25 or so million employees or individuals across the world have used, but it's designed to increase the efficiency of conversations with the notion that we're less likely to change in terms of our innate tendencies. We all know, anybody who has multiple kids know that they come out different unless they're identical twins. They're going to come out somewhat different, and we see those tendencies almost right away. As they're growing up, those are kind of natural predispositions. If we know something about those, we can leverage those to affect the things that are changeable. Like engagement, like well-being, and we shouldn't expect that everybody's going to improve in those areas the same way. So if we know something about those tendencies, we know there's some areas we can rely on. And so those are a couple things I think about in terms of data. Of course, there's a lot of data coming out of executives right now because of all the increase in technology and information. I think to boil it down to the basics, I think too often we have in organizations programs that are disparate, that aren't logically connected to one another. You might have a performance management program over here, and you've got maybe you've got a bunch of forms that people fill out on their employees. You might have an employee engagement survey that comes out once a year, or maybe twice if you do a really good job with it. You might have a learning and development program in another spot, and you might have a wellness program in another spot. If those things are not integrated into a platform that managers can make sense of easily, then you're not going to get much traction on any of them.
Yeah, so important to think about leadership perhaps as caring, caring about people, caring about data, caring about things that are important, and then a willingness to take action on those things, right? I mean, maybe we boil it down to these things around caring and acting. And, Jim, you've spent a good deal of your time innovating, helping us to understand on a global scale how employees think and feel about their experiences. What attracted you to all of that, and what's propelled a now decades-spanning career in that?
Well, I when I was in my early years, I knew that at least I got some feedback that I was good with numbers, and that I knew that I liked studying people, and I got feedback that I was a good writer. This is like high school days or whatever.
Right.
And in college, I didn't know what, we didn't have good methods to kind of know what career you should go into. So I picked business because I thought maybe there's, a broad range of potential opportunities there. And without boring you with all the details, I got an internship in my last year of my undergraduate work in business, and it's a company called Selection Research Incorporated. And they ended up SRI, and they ended up purchasing Gallup actually, and we became Gallup. We combined our deep insights into organizations with our broad polling, and this gives us a chance now to study, the broad population, like the World Poll you talked about, and the tracking we do in the U.S. and other countries, and then go into organizations and change. That 21% globally on engagement is above 70% in the best run organization. So it can be changed. So that makes me excited. But I was fortunate, Mike, to have some really good mentors. I got to work with Don Clifton for 17 years. I got to work with Frank Schmidt, who is a co-inventor of meta-analysis. I got to work with Danny Kahneman, Angus Deaton, both Nobel Prize winners. I've just been very fortunate to have a chance to work with some great people that helped me learn a lot along the way and helped me think about research in a very different way. And when you work with people that change how you think, it has a big impact on your whole, kind of career trajectory. And the bottom line to me is helping organizations create some change. That's what I get excited about.
Yeah. I think some of our best mentors, they make us feel like we're insiders to a field and keep us curious about learning. And I'm sure that engagement expands and increases when someone cares about you. And that is in part the act of mentoring.
That's a very critical part. Yes. If you're going to put it in a nutshell, that you come to work and you know that someone cares about you, he's thinking about what's in your best interest.
Yes.
And you can't fake that. It's got to be something that you really you really want to make happen, and people see it through everyday behavior.
Well, and so important for the many consultants who listen to the Authentic Change podcast is that putting the best interest of your client ahead, creates for some successful consulting experiences and partnerships between client and consultant. Jim, it's been great to have you as a guest on the Authentic Change podcast. And Jim, if people wanted to get in touch with Gallup's work, what's the best way to do that and to get connected with Gallup?
Well, we're on all the social media channels, so you can see us. I'm on LinkedIn myself. If you want to connect with me there, you can do that. We have a website, Gallup.com, where all of our latest research is published. We publish in a lot of other places as well, anywhere from academic to mainstream media. But Gallup.com is kind of a good central place to go. You'll see updates on all of our latest work, and it's kind of continuously coming out. So that's probably the single best place.
That's great. So Gallup.com, visit Jim also on his LinkedIn site. And again, it's just been a great pleasure and a delight for me to have as a guest Dr. Jim Harter, Chief Scientist for Gallup's Workplace Management and Wellbeing practices. And I just encourage everyone also to read his Washington Post and Wall Street Journal bestseller, It's the Manager. It makes so much sense in terms of all the topics related to engagement that we've discussed today. Jim, any last words or comments?
Well, I really appreciate you inviting me on, Mike. It's been a great discussion. We've really enjoyed talking with you, and look forward to tuning into some of your podcasts coming up.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jim Harter. I really appreciate it. And until the next episode of the Authentic Change podcast, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horn.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horn.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.